Hello, YouTube. We are all living in a world full of delusion, so clouded with confusion, that most people are unaware that they are as wrapped up in this mind-controlled system like that of an insect caught and entangled in the devouring spider's web, that they cannot see through the blurring whirlwinds of chaos and lies stitched into the very foundation of value, belief, and perception of reality. I would like to take some time to discuss with you some very important points of the Bible. Things like the past, the present, and what is yet to come. There are thousands of videos here on YouTube about the future according to the Bible, but unfortunately I have found most of them to be incorrect. This is due to the fact that most of them are based on myths, lies, and misconception. I'm not looking to bash anyone for their beliefs. I only want to give the proper perspective of God's Word according to the Old Testament and touching on Revelation. I would suggest, if possible, to obtain a copy of the Tanakh, written in Hebrew, alongside the English, as to note the differences in spellings and major words.
It is God's intention that when a man sees a sword unsheathed and advancing, that the man who sees does indeed warn the people of the impending doom coming before them. I see a sword on high, unsheathed, and approaching swiftly. Before we can explain what will come, we need to understand why it's coming. Starting with creation, we read in Genesis that God created the heavens. He created the sun and the moon as his witnesses to time and season. He created the host of heaven, the Elohim. And he also created the earth, which he commonly calls his footstool. Then God created man in the likeness of the varied characteristics and traits of the Elohim. Although in Genesis it states that all things were created in 6 days, it should be noted that 1 day for God is as 1,000 years for man. And also, if God changed his relative location, this ratio could change as well. As for the Elohim, they are what we call the planets in our solar system. They are best represented as the menorah. Moving on to the Garden of Eden, we have Adam and Eve. In this account in Genesis, we find 4 entities in the Garden of Eden. We have Adam, we have Eve, we have the tree of knowledge of good and bad, and we have the tree of life. The tree of life is God, our Creator, who creates everything. The tree of knowledge of good and bad is the evil one. Of course, then there is Adam and Eve. God commands Adam to avoid the tree of knowledge of good and bad, as it would be a course against his life. We can assume that Adam then makes it clear to Eve to also avoid the tree of knowledge of good and bad, as Eve recites to the evil one what God relayed to Adam. One day, Eve finds herself before the tree of knowledge of good and bad, who then persuades Eve to partake of its fruit. If we put in perspective that at that point, in Genesis 3, we are talking about Adam and his wife, which means that Adam has already had sexual relations with Eve, for that biblically is how man and woman become husband and wife. Later generations included a bride's price, but Eve was a gift from God. It should be noted that in Genesis 4, when Adam knew Eve, Eve conceived and bore Cain. It should also be noted that in the Old Testament, not all the stories are in chronological order. So Eve comes around to taking of the fruit and obtaining the seed. Then Eve has her husband to also take the fruit and the seed. If we look again to Genesis 4, we see that Eve conceives again and bears Abel. However, it does not state that Adam was the one who knew Eve at that time. The reason Eve was kicked out of the garden was for adultery with the evil one. The reason Adam was kicked out of the garden was for homosexuality. If you can understand the story of the fallen angels who took the daughters of men, the evil one was the first angel to fall in this manner. This is a story to explain 2 of the most important commands, but still not the most important command. Skipping down the lineage from Adam and Eve, we look upon Noah and his family as God instructs Noah to prepare to depart from the wicked time on earth. As explained before the flood, The world completely fell away from God. Everything on earth was corrupted. At that time, the Nephilim was rampant, and together with men took to abominable crossbreeding of all species genetics, creating some of what we come to know as dinosaurs. Going back to Noah, Noah entered the ark in his 600th year. It is assumed, because of a verse in the New Testament, that there were 8 people on this ark. This, however, if we continue reading Genesis after the flood, we are able to conclude that the second set of children were born a little after a year after the regression of the flood, which means that there were more than 8 people on that ark. After the flood, God made a covenant with Noah and his family and told them to note the rainbow in the sky as a sign of that covenant. God called it his bow. This is an extremely important perspective to remember. Soon after, Ham violated his father and looked upon his nakedness during his father's drunken stupor. There are a few ways one could look upon their father's nakedness, but it should be understood that Noah, after having 3 sons, while working on his 4th, cursed the 4th son of Ham, and Noah never had a 4th son, even though it was a command from God to continue to multiply. Moving on from Noah, through the firstborn son Shem, we can trickle down to Abraham and his wife Sarah, who traversed a while with Abraham's nephew Lot. Abraham and Lot split at one time due to their vast livestock holdings. Lot moved to Sodom, while Abraham stayed on the west side of the Jordan. One day God crossed before Abraham with 2 other Elohim. Abraham stopped them on their way to Sodom, as they were preparing to destroy it along with Gomorrah. Destined for these cities, the Elohim aspired to destroy them. It is good to note that besides the meaning of the word Sodom, the city of Gomorrah, as written in English, is Amorah in Hebrew, which means to love in excess. Abraham then begot Isaac, Isaac then begot Esau and Jacob. Jacob went and acquired 2 wives from his uncle Laban in Lebanon. Upon his journey back toward Jerusalem, Jacob wrestled about the river with a divine being, who then told Jacob that his name would then be changed to Israel. Israel is a people descended from Jacob, while Israel is the promise of God in Hosea chapter 2 for the coming day of Israel, which God then blesses the tribes of Israel. It is interesting to note that in the story of Jacob and his sons, when most of his sons were fed up with Joseph, whom they labeled the dreamer, they set upon to kill him initially, and in the story, even though they were brothers, they were all from 4 different mothers, and apparently this matters. As we study the story, we find that not all the brothers worked and would shepherd livestock. In fact, it was the sons of the handmaids that did the majority of the work and tended to the livestock. It was the privilege of the sons of Laban's daughters to manage their brothers, the sons of the handmaids. Israel and all of his sons went down to Egypt because of the famine in the land. They progressively became oppressed in the workforce of the national economic infrastructure stimulus of Pharaoh, because Pharaoh bought every asset of life in real estate through the 7-year famine in the land. Also, they became spiritually enslaved by supporting the many gods of Egypt. God then sent before the people of Israel a prophetic leader to lead them back to the promised land of Canaan, known now as Israel. Moshe led the people through the sea to the mountain of Sinai, where Moshe received the covenant, the 10 Commandments. Upon hearing all these commands on Sinai, Moshe recorded in writing all the commands and then relayed these commands to the people. Moshe then concluded the covenant, known as the pact, by dashing the blood upon the people and then blessing them, according to the book of Exodus. After the taking of the covenant, 70 elders of Israel went upon the mountain with Moshe and his attendant YHWH. And in heaven, which is space, they beheld God, what is known as the presence. And the elders were intrigued and bewildered because they saw God, but God did not kill them. And they ate and drank and gave thanks. It should be noted that from the book of YHWH through the books of Kings, everyone who displeased God displeased him by worshipping other gods. This is documented fact. It should be duly noted that everyone who did please God, from the book of YHWH through the book of Kings, including Moshe, did in fact total 24. Coincidentally, there are 24 elders on the thrones in the book of Revelation. I personally don't use the tetragram. David, in his book of Psalms, he writes Hallelujah as praise, give praise to God, or specifically Ayah as his name. And when we look to Moshe, when Moshe asked, "Who shall I say sent me?" he says, Ahaya, Asher, Ahaya, and Hai being connected to the root word for living, as it states in other stories in the Old Testament. One would say, as God lives, or as Ayah lives. And if we don't like those two, we can ask, Abiah, Eliah, Amariah, Ananiah, Athaliah, Azariah, Amaziah, Azaziah, Benaniah, Bithaiah, Chenaniah, Delaiah, Jedaliah, Jeremiah, Jeremiah, Hananiah, Hezekiah, Hizkiah, Hodiah, of course, Ishiah, which means my husband is Ayah, Iokaniah, Idadiah, Jeremiah, I said that, Ariah, Oshiah, Cananiah, with a K instead of a C as well, Ketziah, Keziah, Mariah, Mattaniah, Mattithaniah, Micaiah, Moriah, Nehemiah, Neriah, Nethaniah, Obadiah, Seraiah, Shemaiah, Shemaiah, Tobiah, Uriah, Uziah, Zechariah, Zebediah, Zedekiah, Zephaniah, and Zephaniah. Is that enough? So moving on. So once the Israelites got to Canaan, which is now Israel, they got comfortable and they started falling away from God. This happened repeatedly, and the first thing they did was go worship other gods, which upset God, and it got to the point that God decided to exile them. First, he decided to exile the northern kingdom of Israel to Assyria, and then he decided to exile the southern kingdom of Yehuda to Babylon through Nebuchadnezzar. Now, most people would think, oh, well, Nebuchadnezzar came and took over and ruled for however many years, and then Cyrus came and released all the people. But factually, if we study the Old Testament, we see that Nebuchadnezzar ruled for almost 30 years, and then either his son or his grandson, Belshazzar, ruled for another 3 before it was taken over by the Medes. And if we look to the book of Esther, we find Ahasuerus is the Median descent king who takes over Babylon from Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar's heir. And then Ahasuerus rules for a little over 20 years, and then his son, Darius the Mede, as described in Daniel, takes over. And then after Darius the Mede, then Cyrus takes over and releases the people. And if you look, say, hey, well, I don't understand how Ahasuerus is involved. Well, if we look to Daniel, and Daniel is actually Mordecai in the book of Esther. Esther was Daniel's niece. He took care of her because she had lost her parents as a child, most likely from the exile. So now we look partially to Revelation. We have to know how to put this in order. It's not in chronological order. These letters to the churches, the 7 churches, you can just cut them right out of the book and burn them in a fire. Or use them as toilet paper, because they have no bearing in reality, because God has no churches. The word Bama is significant to the Old Testament, and it means, what is this shrine? And pretty much anything that was anything that was not God's temple, God would say, what is this place? What is this shrine you're doing? What are you doing here, worshiping somebody else? That's the meaning of Bama. So if you put that into Obama's perspective. So now what happens in Revelation 11, 12, 13, first we see the woman hiding for 1,260 days, and the witnesses in sackcloth. Well, this is Esther, who hid 1,260 days, and Daniel, her uncle, who was in sackcloth and ashes for 1,260 days, repenting and fasting. And in the book of Esther, it's important to note that the book of Esther, the events did not take place over just a few days or a few weeks. It was actually over a couple of years. It's important to note that in the book of Esther, that the king only saw people one day every year, which was the 10th month, on the 10th day. So every time they met, it was another year ahead. So if we look to the chapter 12 of Revelation, we find the first beast, who suffered a severe, a mortal wound, but lived. The first beast is King Shaul. King Shaul was the first king of Israel, and he, in fact, after he started going after David, and David got the bread of display and a sword that he killed Goliath with from the priest at Nob. Well, King Shaul found out through one of his minions that the priest gave David the stuff. Of course, the priest didn't know that David was running from the king, or the king wanted to kill him or anything. But then King Shaul had 85 of the Jewish priests slaughtered. So this started the war against the Jews. What happened to King Shaul in his final battle against the Philistines was the Philistines were overpowering them, and King Shaul did indeed suffer a severe mortal wound, but he still lived. And he saw the Philistines closing in on him, and he asked his arms bearer to run him through, so that the Philistines would not make sport of him. The arms bearer obliged and ran Saul through, and then laid on his own sword. Then a little while later, another guy comes walking through the battlefield. I don't know who just goes walking through a battlefield, but this guy comes along and finds Shaul, who is still alive. And King Shaul says, "Look, man, the Philistines are right on top of us. They're gonna, come up to me, and I don't want them to make sport of me. Would you please kill me?" So the guy, okay, he obliges and he kills him. Then the guy goes and tells David, and David puts him to death for killing one of the anointed of God. After this, the Philistines took this dead body, King Shaul's dead body, and his sons, and relatively naked bodies, and they impaled them about the walls, hung them out for public display. This is the image of the first beast. Then we get to the second beast, relatively the exact same image, except for this guy is on a stick of wood. But it's the same image of abomination. If you look to the book of YHWH and even other verses in the Old Testament, the people would conquer the nations around them or the oppressor, and it was common for the people to impale bodies, dead bodies, on stakes. But not to put an affront to God, every time they would take them down at sunset, because if you left them up, then it became an affront to God, or an image of abomination. If we look to Ezekiel 8, we'll find that God takes Ezekiel to the temple, and he shows him the image of abomination coming from the north. Well, let's flip back to Daniel 8. We see the two-horned ram, which signifies the kingdoms of Persia and Media, and they are attacked and conquered by the one-horned goat of Greece, Alexander the Great. Now this horn of Alexander the Great gets split into four, and two of those four become the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north is Julius Caesar. The king of the south is Pompey, his general. And if you look at the events historically of the correspondence and actions between them, you will see that it fits extremely well, if not verbatim, of what's written in Daniel about the king of the north and the king of the south. And this, again, the king of the north and the king of the south, this is religion-based. The king of the north is Christianity. The king of the south is the Muslims. So if we look back to Ezekiel, we see this image of abomination coming from the north, which is the dead guy on the stick. And then God shows him to the north of the altar, the north of the temple wall. On the outside is the site of the image of abomination, which is actually the site where they say that the guy on the stick was hanging out for 3 days. I don't think it could be any clearer than this. If you're disregarding any of these facts, you're just lying to yourself. So then God takes Ezekiel into the inner courtyard, and he shows them women bewailing Tammuz. Why are they wailing Tammuz? What's Tammuz got to do with any of this? Well, JC is a reincarnation of Tammuz. There's only 3 times in history that we have a virgin birth and a resurrection of a dead person. And all 3 times were in myths. So it has no factual basis in reality. You can't be the Son of God and the Son of Man at the same time. It's a contradiction. So choose one. If you choose the Son of God, then it doesn't fit prophetically with God's promises and his prophecy. Because he says his anointed, which is the Son of Man, which means it was born from a man, will come and be a leader to the people and free them. Not that he's any part of a savior. Repeatedly it says in the Old Testament that God is our Father, our Creator. Aya is our only Savior. Now God has a spirit. As you have a spirit, I have a spirit. All living things have a spirit. But there is no separate entity as a spirit that has to do with God. God is one. God has always been one. He always will be one. God lives in space, what we call space. God has never been a man, never will be a man, does not want to be a man, for he is extremely more powerful and awesome than any man could ever be. Now, if we look to Daniel with the 70 weeks prophecy, a lot of people think this prophecy has something to do with the Antichrist. Unfortunately, for those people, there is no Antichrist. Fortunately, for the reality, there's no Antichrist. This is a Christian creation, has no bearing on the Old Testament. What we find in the 70 weeks is that for 7 weeks, the anointed becomes anointed, and then for 62 weeks, he builds with his own hands the temple of God. Now, this already happened on the return back from Babylon of the exiled Judeans, Yehudans. Zerubbabel, who is the lineage of King David, is the acting anointed of that line. Now, with him also rules the priest of the stock of Zadok, Ishua, who was priest at that time. And if you read Zechariah, they were made diadems for these two, and they were anointed. This is the prophecy of the anointed of God. So for 1 week, as we wait for the last week of the 70 weeks, it says for 1 week he will make covenant with many, and for then half a week he will put a stop to the sacrifices. This is not about anybody else other than the anointed of God. For when he returns, he will take 1 week of covenant, which is the week of unleavened bread. And he will take that week with the people as covenant. And then after this, that's when the rest of Revelation actually starts. If you read the end of Zechariah, you will see that God instructs, O great mountain, whoever you are, lay flat before Zerubbabel. This is God's granting of universal power to and only to Zerubbabel, and telling everyone, no matter who they are, even a great mountain, that you should bow down before Zerubbabel, for he has the power of the anointed. You have to put the woes in order to understand this. You can't have woe, woe, woe before woe, and you can't have woe, woe before woe. It needs to be woe, 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 and then woe, woe, woe. It's pure logic and simple. So the first woe is the throwing of the boulder into the sea, which we call trumpet 5. And this unleashes the 200 million Nephilim. I know a lot of people out there think that this is 200 million ghosts or demons, and that's not true. This is just truly based in reality, and it's all logical. It's 200 Nephilim, or lion, men, and Joel. It is good to note that the angels at the four corners of the earth, one has a bow, one has a sword, one has a set of scales, and then death follows behind the other one. You can easily see this in the alignment of the planets at this time. Remember the bow. The bow is very important. Now, if we note that one of these angels here, or a voice during this time of the four angels, states that 1 day's pay will be equal to 3 loaves or 3 quarts of barley, and 1 day's pay would be equal to 1 quart or 1 loaf of wheat. This is extremely important to note the timing of these events. For the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts the barley harvest. And then the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts the Omer count to the 7 weeks to the Feast of Fruits, or the wheat harvest. So now stating that you get 3 loaves of barley means that they had no problem in harvesting the barley. But when we get to the wheat, only 1 loaf or 1 quart is ready, which means that the rest of the wheat was destroyed by the events that happen after. So we should be able to expect the Nephilim after the barley harvest, but before the wheat harvest. You want to understand the number of the beast? It's easy. How they give the sign of the beast on the right hand and on the forehead. Well, this is what they do in a baptism, a Christian baptism. And the number of the beast is 666. This is the total number if you take the name of the beast and multiply each letter in the name by 9. So if we take J times 9, E times 9, S, U, and S each by 9, and add them together, you will get 666. This is the only name in creation that gives you 666. If you're saying Nero gives you 666, you need to go back to school, because you're one off at 667. Sorry, bud. For they cannot buy or sell without the mark of the beast. This has already been established in the Crusades. Stop lying to yourself. Let's look at the lineage of the New Testament in Matthew. Total hogwash. They can't even take verbatim to write down from Chronicles 1 into a new book and give correct lineage from David to Zerubbabel. And they error at least 3, maybe 4 generations. And then there's another list of genealogy in the New Testament, and I'm not even going to discuss that because it's total nonsense. I don't even know who those people. I've never heard of these people. Not in this chronological order. So, if you want to take the birthing incident, okay, well, one story says that the mages came after seeing the king, and the king wanted to kill the newborn baby because he knew it was prophecy and whatever. So the father has a dream, and that night they leave for Egypt, when God says never to go back to Egypt. Then the conflicting story about the birth, what happened after that, is that the mother and father, I can't really even call it a father, of the newborn baby, they concluded all the ritual requirements for the child at that time, which means that they would have had to say 33 days before they could go back to the temple to cleanse the mother and the child of the birth. So if they stayed 33 days, of course the king would have found them and killed them. So these two contradicting stories are total nonsense. If you want to look at the tale of the guy, the head guy, JC, walking through the wheat field with his buddies, his hoodlum buddies, on the Sabbath, and they're going through the wheat field, and they start picking off the crop and eating it with their hand. And then some Pharisee comes up and says, "Hey, you can't do that. You know, don't you know it's a Sabbath?" And then the head guy says, "Hey, don't you know what happened with David back in Nob when the priest gave him the bread and whatever?" Well, there's no reason for this whole story. It's total nonsense, because if you read Deuteronomy 23:25 and Deuteronomy 23:26, it clearly states that if you walk through a wheat field or a vineyard of any type, that it is totally kosher to pick off the fruit, or pick off the harvest, the crop, and eat it. Pick it off with your hand and put it in your mouth and eat as much as you want. That's exactly what it says. The only thing you cannot do is chop it down or haul it away. And of course, on the Sabbath, both of these things were thought of at work. So unless the guy's hacking the stuff down and stealing it from somebody else's property, or hauling it away, again stealing it from somebody else's property, there's no realization of anything logical here. It's total farce. So if you're willing to believe these stories, you don't know the Old Testament, you don't know God's Word, and it will haunt you. So now is the time, before these events start happening, to get right with God, to lose the idol stick and any worship of anyone else other than Aya. It states that in the last days, the silver and gold will not avail you to save you. This is directly to state that it's the silver and gold, not specifically of themselves, but because they cover the idol sticks, the worshipping things. That is why they are an abomination. That's why they will not save you, because they are covering your idols. It's not silver and gold specifically by themselves. They will still buy you stuff, especially with the Nephilim. It's the idols that they cover. So as in Joel, the book of Joel, that explains the lion men coming, and also states again in the later chapters of the book of Ezekiel how the lion men figures face across from the human figures about the temple. I mean, it's all about that. If you don't read that, you'll never understand. But as God says, in that day, if you call upon Him, His name, Aya, you will be saved. If you're calling on somebody named JC, you're waiting on the wrong bus, and it's not coming. This is my warning to you, the world. I hope that it wakes a lot of you up. I understand, because of the fundamentals and your foundations, that most of you will deny these things, but that's not my issue. That's yours. As long as I've told you, I'm clear. Have a good day.